reconcile a good God and evil in the world? So another way to phrase that, if God is really good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world?
I've been thinking about that one. I think that's a really relevant question. I think that that's something that we all struggle with, and I think each of us, myself included, is part of that. Is part of why is there an evil world? Like we all make. I like to think of the world that God created has a very perfect and best intent for our lives, and He created us to have a relationship with Him, and He created us to have a relationship with each other. But we don't always do that perfectly, and so in that we make choices, and our choices impact other people both positively and negatively. And choices are also a freedom of will. And so when we have free choice, we get to try things out. But that also means that we can try to do what God has best intent for us, His will for our lives, what He's called us to do and be, or we can choose to go in the opposite direction, and what that ends up being, maybe not intentionally, is that we hurt people. And so when we hurt people, there's just natural consequences for when we choose to go against God's best intent, and generations upon generations upon generations that spins into we have evil, right? Because we also have good and we have choice. And so we can't have choice without evil. And so God gave us choice to both pick Him or to not. And so He allows us choice. So it's a hard space to be in, but that's kind of one of the ways that I've reconciled that thought.
Yeah, I think that this is just about any time you do a question and answer, this is one that's on the list because it's so relevant, particularly if you've experienced some form of suffering or pain or victimization or evil against you, or if you have committed evil or wrong against somebody and have, as you just said, used your own free will to either intentionally or unintentionally harm others. So very much so, because of the gift of free will, evil exists. In theology, we have this word called theodicy, which is the big fancy word for how do you reconcile a good God and evil existing. And I think that atheist kind of philosophies often use what we call the problem of evil to say, because evil exists, there is no God. And so there's logical arguments that they put forth to say, because evil and all this awful and atrocious things happen in the world, therefore a good, loving, omnipotent, all-powerful God can't exist. The irony in that is, and we'll try not to get too technical here, the fact that evil exists and the fact that we recognize evil exists is actually a proof that God exists. I know you're like, what just happened here, right? So the fact that we recognize and are asking, how can evil exist, is actually a proof that God exists. Here's how that works. If we say that if evil exists, good must also exist. Okay? You with me so far? If evil exists, good must also exist. But if evil and good both exist, there must be a moral law that differentiates between what is good and what is evil. If you don't have some sort of standard, there has to be some sort of standard that says this is evil, this is good. So if we say this is evil, we're making some sort of moral judgment that says this is the standard that proves this is evil. Are you with me? So if evil exists, good must exist. If good and evil exist, a standard must exist. If the standard really does exist, there must be a moral law giver, which is God. Do you follow that? The fact that we recognize that evil exists is actually proof that God exists. So that's just the introductory kind of argument in how do we reconcile this. That doesn't negate or kind of get rid of the feeling of evil or the fact that, okay, God, why do you allow it to happen? So we haven't gotten that far yet. but it does reconcile that God does exist even in the midst of all this evil. So if you want to take it the next step further and ask the question like, why God, if you really do love me, if you really do love humanity, how are you allowing all this to happen? If you really are good, if you really do love me, why? That's the next question. And I would say again, we can get kind of technical in our argumentation for this. I've found it most helpful to think about it this way. Can someone give an example to me of temporary pain resulting in some sort of greater good? Can you think of some sort of example in your life or in life in general where temporary pain leads to greater good? Anybody? Can you think of something? Some sort of temporary pain.
Working out.
Working out, sure. Okay, yeah, you've got temporary pain in your muscles. But it ultimately leads to a greater good. So some sort of temporary pain leads to greater good. Another example, anybody? Can you think of something else?
Just the strength and adversity in general. Like if you get bullied in school and you grow up like tougher and more resilient.
Sure.
Childbirth.
I mean, it turned out mostly good.
What about something like surgery, medical type things, right? So here's an analogy for you. Okay, so we just mentioned childbirth, so we'll talk about like kids and parents. So you have a kid. At some point in time, you take that child to get their shots, right? Okay. So think about it from the perspective of the child. So they're in this room that's unfamiliar with their parent, and then another unfamiliar person in a white coat comes in and sticks a needle into them. And then they cry and wail and almost look to mom or dad like, why are you allowing this to happen? If you love me, if they could think like this, if you loved me, you wouldn't let that mean person stick that thing in me that hurts. But the parent has a broader perspective, has more knowledge, has greater understanding, and knows that the temporary pain leads to greater good. Namely, you're not going to get typhoid or yellow fever or hepatitis B or whatever name the other shots that you get. They know that the temporary pain leads to greater good. So if it's possible that temporary pain can lead to greater good, is it possible, let's do a thought experiment, that God, our Heavenly Father, is like the parent and we humans are like the child? We experience the pain and we, like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? But Him in His infinite knowledge and understanding knows that what He is allowing will lead to greater good. Does that make sense?
Much more needs to be said. I will say that there's a...
He's better at like the academic arguments that I can't follow. Like with the really, really smart people and like, dude, I don't know what you're saying. Like, just think about it.
What's interesting is there's a pretty well-known like atheist philosopher. His argument says if there is a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, all good, kind of knows everything. He said then that God would be able to, if that being existed, then that God could prevent. He calls it he kind of lays it out like any, like kind of this mysterious stuff, like the real bad stuff, like genocide or rape or things like that. That God could, if there really was a being that was all powerful, all knowing, all good, that He could prevent, some of the worst types of suffering. And then the next line of thought of William Rowe, he says, if He could, then if this all powerful, all knowing God did exist, then his next logical step is that He should prevent that if it doesn't lead, and He even gives you if it doesn't lead to either more suffering or a greater good. So he even kind of lets that argument be like, okay, well, I'll take that, or I'll give that to you. And then he says his third logical argument is if that God, if there was a being who could do this and it didn't lead to the greater good or the lesser evil or whatever, he says then he could, then he should. And then he said because he doesn't, the next conclusion is basically because there is this kind of rampant evil in the world that no one can explain, that just kind of seems outrageous. He says the next step in his argument is, well, there can't be a good, all-knowing, all-powerful being. Because if there was, he could stop it, he should stop it, and since it doesn't seem like he does, there's no God. That's sort of the way William Rowe lays out his argument. So he gives you the well, if it doesn't lead to the greater good, or if it doesn't lead to the rebuttal to that, or not the rebuttal, but just another side to that, because I actually think that's a really good argument, like a really valid argument from this atheistic philosopher. What he doesn't ask the question though is this, or I think the question that I would love to ask William Rowe is just is simply this: if God could and if God should, why is it? Why should I know what his good reasons are to allow or to prevent any certain kind of evil? So if God were to come to me and say, hey, I'm going to allow you to get the shot in the arm, but I'm not going to tell, well, you're going to get the shot in the arm, but I'm not going to tell you why or for what reason, because honestly, you wouldn't understand. We assume that as the child in the office, when mommy says, hey, this is to prevent hepatitis A, and here's all the things that hepatitis A can give you if you catch it, so this is why you're getting the shot. Wes would be or he'd pick his nose, or he'd do something he doesn't know, he has no ability to rationalize or to understand why it's helpful, other than, buddy, hang in there, you'll understand someday, And what I would love for William Rowe to answer is if God does have good reasons to allow something, the assumption is that God would tell me, and that even if he did tell me, I would actually understand what those reasons are. That's a huge assumption in my book, because we're sitting in here as finite beings having these kinds of questions, and God's most likely sitting up there going well, yeah, dude, I get it. I created all of this. I kind of knew this was going to happen, and some of these things. And so, but in our finite, limited ability to understand, we just assume even if God were to tell us why, we would understand or know. There's a good chance if God did tell us why he would allow certain things, we would never even understand it. That's actually probably the correct assumption, right? That we would have no idea why God allows certain. And God would say, well, it's actually for this good, and let me string it. And we'd just sit there huh? You know what I mean? We'd be the two are I don't even get it, Because that's sort of the difference between this all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipresent being, and us in our, finite minds, we don't get it, we're so limited. And so sometimes we assume certain things that I would understand God's good reasons. I think that's a huge assumption. Maybe the one thing a guy like William Rowe probably leaves it, there's an assumption there that I think he leaves out of his argument, that we somehow would understand in our finite minds. And so there's a mystery to some of this, that's part of, I think, where faith comes in. We're us finite beings, faith is this trust and belief that a good, that God does know, and that it's okay if I don't understand everything, and it's actually okay if I can't reconcile every single thing in my own mind. That's okay, it's okay. And it's so hard because you're kind of I gotta let go. Because I may not ever be able to understand. Maybe someday I will, that's why older people, there's some older people, right, you're just that dude's wise, or that lady's super wise, they just know stuff. It's well, yeah, because they're 60 years old and they've lived a lot of life and they've gone through a lot of, and so they're able to, they understand things at another level that we don't understand yet because we're not there, And sometimes that's how it is with God. God's I can't even tell you my good reasons yet because you wouldn't understand it yet. So in my good time, I'll let you know. I'll tell you. And for some of us, it won't be until we die and go to heaven because we'll never grow up enough to ever understand it, Just to be truthful, But anyway, it's a fantastic question and a really hard one to wrestle with. And there's honestly like a million different arguments for or against it. So
We got good book recommendations if you want to read about that subject.
Yep.
How do you get out of a funk or dry season?
In what context? Like a little bit of eczema or like?
Yeah, the next line, thank you, says you want to be on fire for God, but you don't have the drive, and it feels like you keep hitting a brick wall.
Been there?
See?
Sorry.
Great.
It's normal, guys.
It's
Yeah.
very normal. It happens in rhythms, like the
Yeah.
seasons. Like we have
Mhm.
fall, winter, spring, summer. We also have those seasons with, our relationship with God. And so there's times where, it's budding and things are coming alive and it's exciting. And then there's like summer where you're like, woo, this is, you're on fire and this is really exciting. And then like there comes this like kind of where there's this letdown almost like, maybe after a camp or after kind of a spiritual high, there's this fall letdown, and then might be winter where there is this maybe seemingly void. But if, to be honest, like I'm all for the summer, like woo, like, and sometimes I'll put myself in what I would consider like spiritually risky like things, like put myself in faith situations where I really have to trust God so that I'm in that summer area more and more. But the longer that I'm, every year that I get older, I'm like, oh, dear goodness, that's exhausting. So I think there's also, winter is also for rest, because so that we're ready and we've been rested to then, and when spring comes and he starts to reveal maybe those next things that he's wanting you to learn, and then when you're fully in it in the summer and you're learning those things, like, then you're, you have that energy, and then it's seasonal though, and to find those rhythms, and that's normal. So,
Are you looking?
I am, but I can't remember the passage.
Yeah, I think it's.
I can badly paraphrase it. I'm trying to find it.
Can you see the page on your Bible?
No.
Uh,
Yeah, well, kind of, yeah.
Like yours, not mine. I get that some ways. Like my wife will have her Bible out. And I'm like, I need my Bible. I can see where it is on the page in my version. There, it's like it's supposed to be on the right hand corner. It's not there in this one. Yeah, I think that dry season, desert season, seasons where you don't feel it is absolutely normal. And if someone comes up and says, like, I've never had that, then I would be hesitant to actually believe that and say you're just in self-denial, probably. So, I mean, you read the Psalms, and it's like, it's all over the place of desertness, of dryness, of like, God, where are you type of seasons. I think there's a couple important questions to ask, because there's various ways that we can get into that season. One, if you find yourself in that kind of season, I think it definitely is important to ask the question if there is, since I saw Corinthians, I'm thinking about it, test yourself to make sure that you're in the faith. So there is something important about self-reflection of, have I gotten to this dry season where I feel like God is distant because there's habitual, unrepentant sin in my life? Am I living in such a way where I'm living autonomous and for myself and my own desires rather than living for the kingdom of God? And is that why I feel like God is distant? Is there some sort of habitual, unrepentant sin in my life? And because sin separates us from God. So that can be, I can feel like I'm in a desert season, but it's a desert season of my own making. Like I just walked into the desert of my own accord, and I'm like, why am I here? Well, dude, you walked there yourself. The way out is repentance and confession. Or repentance and confession. That's how you get back to the oasis. So that is, I think, an important question to ask. Another one can potentially be that Jesus, in the Gospels, we read that the Spirit drove him into the desert. I think there are absolutely times where God leads us into desert seasons for very specific purposes. And that time Jesus was in the literal desert to be tempted by the devil for 40 days. And so I think there is precedent there that God does lead his children into desert seasons for various reasons of growth and things of that nature. And if that's the case, then the question shouldn't be, how do I get out of this? But Lord, what are you doing in me? And what are you preparing me for? And Lord, have your way with me in this season. I will rest in the truth that you are good and you love me, even when I don't feel it. I think a third potential question or scenario is to say or ask, if I'm in a desert season, we were actually just chatting about this last night over dinner, are you using your gift? There's nothing, there's few things where I feel the presence of God more or most than when engaging in discipleship of whatever that might look like in your spiritual gift context. But when using the God-given gift that you have, there's something that is very connected to the Spirit of God when you're using your spiritual gift. So I might ask the question, if you feel that you're in this desert season, do you just ask the question like, are you engaging in discipleship activities? If you're not, then the Lord's probably prompting you, what are you sitting on your butt for? Like, I gave you a gift, there's work to be done. There's other things to say on that as well. But
I was just thinking, as you guys are both talking, like there's a couple responses to a dry season. Either try to recreate the experience of the high of following Jesus, or you just become apathetic, you know? So it's like, God, I feel like I'm in a dry season. So I either try to shoot myself up with consolation, metaphorically speaking, or or you just grow apathetic. You know, it's like, this doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter what I do, and it's just a dry season, and we just kind of like, we sit there and wait for God to just magically zap me out of it, you know? And I just think that that's maybe the most risky business, is just kind of crossing our fingers and hoping God just zaps us and something changes. I was thinking about, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 3, he says, but I, brothers and sisters, cannot address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh. So he's basically like, so then he says, as infants in Christ, like you're a bunch of babies is what he's saying. And then he says, because I fed you with milk and not solid food, because you weren't ready for it yet. So he's like, I'm literally giving you you're nursing. That's what it is. So you're feeding from your mother's, breast. Like, that's the analogy he gives. Like, you're eating like a baby, And he goes, because you're not ready for solid food yet. And sometimes I think a lot of the spiritual high stuff that's like milk. Like, God's good enough when we first come to know him that it's like, you kind of feel this euphoric, like, oh my gosh, Jesus, you're amazing, and I love you so much, and you've changed my whole life, and and it's kind of this like, oh my goodness, this is so awesome, or you go to a camp or whatever, and you're just like in this blissful state of naivety, and you're just like, oh Jesus, you're everything. And then a week later, you're like, do you even exist anymore, God? What the frick? Just kind of, so it's like, you're like, God, how did I go from here to here in 7 days? Like, how is that even possible? And I think I think there's several reasons for it, but I wonder sometimes if it isn't because God's saying hey, I'm with you in the high, but I'm also in the valley waiting for you before you even get there. But we think God's only in the high. And we don't even see God as being totally and fully present in the dry season. And so we sit in the dry season and we're like, God, where are you? You're so far from me, and why would you hide your face from me? And like David would write in the Psalms. And God's like, what are you talking about? I'm already here. If you read Psalms 23, right? It says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he says, I will fear no evil, for you like God was in the pastures, by the rivers, by the still water, like restoring souls. You're like, oh, bliss, you know? And then it's like, yea, though I walk, you're like, whoa, the valley of the shadow of death, like, where'd that come from? I was just by a nice river, like, you know, sipping out of the pure water, and now I'm like in this dry debt. Like, how did that, like, how did I, you know, confusion. And God's saying, like, yeah, I'm in both places, actually. And when I lead you there, and sometimes I lead you there, sometimes you find yourself there out of your own kind of coming undone, the consequence of your own actions. There's a myriad of reasons why we end up there, probably. But I think he's there. Well, I know he's there already. He's actually waiting for us to meet him there. But often we're in the valley, we're like, God, where are you? And he's like, you know, like I'm literally right here. It doesn't feel like it, partially because, dude, it's time for you to grow up and stop nursing from your mama's teeth. Like, it's time for you to eat solid food. That means, no, I'm being serious though. It's like I'm being serious because it's like it's time for you to not eat that anymore. Like Newell's kind of hybrid right now, like still nursing, like starting to eat some solid food. At some point, like Wes, his last nursing was like, hey buddy, like ready to nurse? And he's like, no, I'm done. Like, that's it. Solid food's good enough for me. I don't need that anymore. But oftentimes we don't realize there's sort of the seasons of consolation and desolation. Consolation is the great emotional feelings of God. Like, where God's like, he's just, I mean, he's literally like, here, like, come and eat. Eat all this baby food, you know? He's like, that was good. You know, come and eat. But at some point he's like, grow up. Like, this is good, but tri-tip, come on. Like, seriously, like, grow up and eat some solid food.
You have tri-tip up here?
You know? Oh, yeah. For sure. Yeah.
I've been to some states and they don't know what tri-tip
That is
is.
true,
And
yeah.
so-
No, it's a thing.
Okay.
I've learned that it
Yeah,
was.
we get it off our cows out back.
But I think God's often saying, like, hey, I want you to recognize, like, part of you growing up is recognizing that I'm with you in whatever season you're in. Whether it's the highest of high or the valley below, like, I'm there and I'm with you. And that's growing up in your faith. Because growing up in your faith is saying, God, whether I'm in the highest high or in the lowest valley, like, how are you forming yourself in me right now? Even when I don't feel it, even when the consolation, the really good food that I really like and is really comfortable for me, when that's been taken away, God, you're still good. And you actually want me to grow up. You want me to learn to trust you even when I don't feel it. That's called maturing, friends. You know? And so the dry seasons, totally normal and to be expected. And those, in my estimation, are some of the greatest growing seasons of your life. If you'll have the perspective to ask, God, what are you doing right now in me? If you'll ask that question and have that perspective rather than just, God, this sucks. I mean, it's okay to do that. I'd actually encourage you to do that. But then take a step, seriously, like, get it off your chest. It's all good. He can take it. But then after you've done that, step back and go, God, what are you trying to teach me now? Like, I mean, you'll see that in the Psalms. You read any of the lament Psalms? I mean, David's just like, God, I mean, he's basically saying, God, you suck. Here's the middle finger. And then by the end of the Psalm, he's like, search me and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in me, and then lead me in the way. I mean, he just unrelentingly lets God have it. Like, there would be cussing all over if you could read the Hebrew. Like, God, you know? And then it's like, oh, be still and know that I'm God. You're still good. You've been faithful all along. Okay. You know? And so dry seasons to be expected. God, what are you teaching me in